But let's talk some randomness here. I know for people who use optimizers, this is something I've personally had questions about, and I think what you have mentioned is that people sometimes misunderstand exactly what randomness is doing. So I think you're going to share your screen with me here. I'm going to add it, and I'm going to give you the floor.
So with randomness, I guess just briefly, I'm going to use FC, but it would work with any optimizer. Randomness is shown down here. There's FC has two different randomness distributions: normal distribution and classic. Normal distribution distributes the random. So randomness basically just takes whatever percentage amount you put, and then there's actually a description right here. No, they used to have a more clear description, but it takes like a percentage of their points and then randomly distributes it for classic. So let's say there's a 10-point change on a player's total point projection based on your randomness, and they have 60 points projected. They'll get anywhere between 50 and 70 points every crunch. Each player, based on however much randomness you give to them, will randomly populate in between those numbers. And normally distributed is just like a normal distributed bell curve. So it's like less, there's less chance of getting the tail ends, where in classic, you have the exact amount of chance to get any of those points within the 10-point range. Mm-hmm. I hope that made sense. That was a pretty poor explanation, but I think most people know what randomness is anyways. And you can do this. I think you can pretty much do this on every optimizer now. You can make individual randomness amounts for each player, which is what we'll go over in a second. So the first thing I want to address is what we've kind of been talking about since our MMA stream, where I feel like a lot of DFS players feel like randomness and uniques, the amount of players you'll use in a lineup, is some sort of like solution to picking the right lineups, like some sort of game theory adjustment, right? And so that's kind of what I'm pushing back against. It doesn't really give you any game theory advantages over other people. And the reason I think that a lot of people think it does is because they always ask, like in the Osmo Slack or on Twitter, like how much randomness do you use and what's unique? How many uniques do you use? Right. It's like they kind of think that 33% randomness and 2 uniques is somehow a solution to getting good lineups. Right. But it really doesn't do anything like that. All it does is shuffle the players. That's really all it does. Uniques does something similar too. So the more uniques you add, the more player pool you're going to get. The more randomness you get, the more shuffling it's going to do. But it doesn't necessarily give you any advantage over someone else. So like if Osmo uses 75% randomness, that's not like some game theory edge he has over you. What he's doing, actually, I don't know what he's doing, but what a lot of people could do or should do, and this isn't exactly how I do it anyways, is I just put 20% randomness in here. It doesn't really matter. But when you run your lineups, it's the randomness actually kind of hurts you, because assuming you have good projections, which is the whole point of this, right? We all want to start with good projections. It's going to put a bunch of bad lineups in there, which we don't want.
Explain that. Why would they be bad lineups?
Because you're going to hit the tail ends of the distribution. So when you use this, 20%, I wish there was if you look at a bell curve, most 95% of the expected numbers are going to be coming in between the top of the bell curve and the 2 tail ends, right? A bell curve goes like this, and the tail ends are the 5% chance of happening. When those 5% happen, there's a reason you don't want that. And in classic randomness, it's going to be even more so because it's a flat distribution. So when you hit the tail ends, so like let's say 6-year golfers hit the tail bottom end of their distribution, you're going to get some garbage lineups because you're going to get 6 golfers who are projected at 60, or I should say, let's say they hit the high end of their lineups. 6 golfers who are projected at 50 points, they all now have 60, and then that'll make that lineup in there for you. Or it depends, because that's just like 10%. If people do 75, 100%, 150% randomness, you're just going to get. So like here, we could show right now. If I just jack this up, change all players, classic randomness, 150% ownership. Look at the ownership distribution. It went from Rory at 78%, right, to a bunch of 20%ers. Which is fine if like this is what the distribution you might want to end up with in this range. This seems a little low to me, and that's a decent amount of players in your player pool. That's probably too high. But for sure, and this is only 300 lineups, some of these lineups are going to be garbage. And so a quick way you could just check is just sort by projected. And I think in Roto Grinders, theirs is automatically sorted by projection, but I think you could change that. You could just take a look. So the top projected points, and this is just Fantasy Cruncher's default setting. So don't pay attention to this. They let it be known that their numbers aren't meant to like win you tournaments. So 404 basically, and the bottom one is 323, right? 80 point difference. That's pretty huge. You can, I mean, it's not insane. That's a pretty insane swing between the two. I don't think you want your amount max and minimum that far apart. I mean, and if you are, okay, this is in lieu of adjusting for ownership and stuff like that and figuring out the game theory of that, right? Just a blanket. Why would, if these projections were great, like why would you want to take an 80 point less saying ownership doesn't matter? You never would. You're just giving yourself a shittier shot. And if you can get the same expectation from a lineup with 40 or 50 more points than that, why would you risk it? And so using too much randomness, that can happen. So it's not the end of the world. You could still use 150% randoms or whatever. I mean, I think that's pretty high. And then just lap off a bunch of the garbage lineups. Right? Mm-hmm. So like if we did, let's say, what's about middle here maybe? Let's see what this looks like. Okay, yeah, that's good enough. There. So I just lapped off the bottom half, and now Rory went back up. So now what this did is it shuffled a whole bunch of lineups compared to the 20% normal, right? There's a whole bunch more lineups being shuffled. It has more players in there, and you could go in there and tinker with it to get your player pool down. You can get rid of what Manny Laura calls these apple bottoms here, the 1%ers, maybe even the 2%ers. And I'm not saying like this is some sort of a great strategy here. I'm just trying to give like the idea of what people think that randomness somehow solves a bunch of issues for them. And so, it doesn't. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So one question that I've had is in something you'll see is say there's a extreme, this doesn't happen in golf as much, but say there's an extreme value punt play. We've seen it with MMA recently where a fighter withdraws. And so now the guy who was maybe a -110 is now like a -600 favorite and his salary is still really affordable. So if you run your lineup run, you're going to get, maybe 80 to 90%, maybe even 100% of him because he's such an incredible value. If you ratchet up the randomness, then all of a sudden he's going to come down and maybe you only have 50%. How do you think about randomness, both for like extreme value plays where it's just like he has to be basically in your lineups, and also for sports with a lot of dupes?
Well, those are like two different, pretty different strategy that you need to really think about. So like dupes, you don't want a ton of dupes. So you got to do everything you can to not get dupes. I don't care what the value is.
Right.
If you're going to have a 268 duped League of Legends lineup, you're just throwing money away.
Right.
And same thing for MMA or NASCAR, any of the high dupe sports. You don't want the dupes. And then I don't care about value. If my dupes are, and you could try to figure out how to project dupes. Is something you should try. And then I don't care. I'm not allowing. I'm trying to figure out how many dupes I'm going to have and then get rid of all the high. So I don't care about value at that point. But if you just like leave dupes aside and value, and how could you use randomness to like help you make your decision, is like slate over slate. So like in the MMA example where the fighter's out, you can compare. Let's say you do 75% randomness is your go-to number, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, what happens in let's say your process has been the same the last 3 weeks, the last 3, Saturdays for fights. What you have to recognize, like, what's the difference each time? So, like, if I'm putting in 75% randomness and getting, 50% is my highest owned fighter for the way I build my lineups, but then this week it's like 80 or 90. Well, that's good because you're doing the exact same process. You're putting a bunch of randomness on there, and this guy's still popping up. So, like, it's not like that's like it's just a good example of like, wow, okay, this guy definitely is a ton of value. Now you have to go the next steps and adjust for ownership, figure out dupes, right, and then lop off lineups even after you do all that are just garbage from using so much randomness.
Yeah.
But like, if a guy's high value, like, again, you have to, like, let's say there is no dupe issue and there is no ownership issue. Well, then you just use the guy with a high value. The only reason you're not using him is because of ownership. It's not because of randomness.
Right.
Right. That's all just game theory stuff. It's not randomness. Randomness will shuffle him enough to get him lower. And it depends on how much randomness you use and how much of high value he actually is based on each slate. So some slates, that high value might not be in a ton of laps. Some slates it might.
So would you say then, to put kind of a button on this, that the value of using randomness ultimately is to present more lineups for you to review and then make decisions on? Because if you don't, you're going to get a specific set.
No, I think it's just for shuffling. But there is one thing I want to go over, that how you can use randomness to help your game.
Yeah.
So what I was in part 1 there, I was just explaining, like, this is how I think most people think randomness is. And obviously DFS players are all a snowflake. They all have their own unique process. But that's kind of the general idea I get when people talk about randomness, right? But here's how you can actually use randomness in a useful game. I guess it's not really game theory. It's kind of just more using math. But okay, so let's just use just 20% and 2 uniques. This isn't like the one. It's not how I do it specifically. It's just, whatever. It's just something to use. So let's do a quick run here. So everyone's got the same amount of randomness, right? And I took Mark Hubbard and made his projection the same as Vaughn Taylor because they have the same salary. So after this runs, you'll see, okay. They both have basically the identical ownership percentage, right? 26 and 27%. If I would have ran 500, it probably would have equalized at some point. But I'm sure they're about exactly the same linership. Now let's move. It doesn't really matter, Hubbard or Taylor. Let's just change that one guy's ownership. I'm sorry, randomness. And then run the crunches. So here we go. Now look at this. Vaughn Taylor's now got 22 points more ownership, even though they're identical players.
Because you're tapping into more of his higher range of outcomes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what you could do with randomness, if you want, is this is that boom or bust. The reason this works is because in a video I did a while ago, like a boom or bust video, I don't remember what I titled it, but I use like an example of horses. This is that in practice, that video. So I don't need to recap it, but you can go watch if someone wants to. when you have the same exact horse, I guess, or player, and one of them has a higher boom bust, which is exactly what randomness does, you're going to get, and there's more than one racer, you're going to get more of the other one. So this is a way where you don't have to mess with the guy's projection. If you think they have a higher upside, if you handicap it where they have a higher upside, if you run standard deviation numbers on individual players and you really trust those, and one guy's higher than another, where you could go in and individually change their standard deviation. I'm sorry, their randomness based on the standard deviation, or however you want to do it.
Gotcha.
And it doesn't have to be this extreme either, right? Like you could just think, like, do we got another comparable one here? It doesn't really matter. Let's say Stuart Sink, even though he's an old golfer, so you probably like him too. If he was, let's say you thought because he's old as hell, he's got a better chance of winning it more often, but like his projection should be the same and his miscut is the same, but you just think when he gets hot or something like that. You could up him a little bit, and then you're going to get a few more of them. So it doesn't even have to be this dramatic of a 80% difference.
Gotcha.
But you could do that with 6, 10, 12 different guys, and then it kind of organically will pick out those guys in more lineups without messing with their projection. Gotcha. Especially if you trust your projections or you're paying for them or whatever. So that is actually using randomness, in a thought out mathematical manner. The other stuff is just shuffling it. It's not giving you anything. Now, if you go and line up rewind, which I don't know if people know, you can go up here and you go into this lineup rewind page, and it goes back to past tournaments. I think it's free too, so anyone can use it. And you could check and see like put in your old projections or put what you think, and then it could test it against actual events and see how you did. And you could go in and and play around with this stuff there.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's how I would do. That's how I would do randomness. So I would put in however much you feel comfortable. The more you do, the more you're gonna have to lop off. If your exposure is too high, you can put in more, lop off more after that, or more, maybe 2 uniques. I wouldn't really go much higher than that, but I guess you could. And then individually personalize the randomness for each player.
Awesome.